Egypt, a land of towering pyramids, golden treasures, and enigmatic pharaohs. We all have a certain image of this ancient civilization, shaped by movies and museum exhibits. But what if I told you that much of what you think you know is wrong, and that the real story of Egypt, both ancient and modern, is far more surprising and, frankly, more bizarre than you could ever imagine? Today, we're counting down the top 10 things about Egypt you might not know. Number 10. The pyramid builders weren't slaves. Let's start by dismantling one of the biggest myths. The idea that the pyramids were built by slaves whipped into submission is a dramatic image, but it's not historically accurate. In fact, the massive tombs were constructed by paid, skilled laborers. Archaeologists have uncovered entire villages where these workers and their families lived. They had access to good food, medical care, and even were buried in honored tombs near the pyramids they built. Graffiti left behind by the work crews revealed they had team names like the Drunkards of Menkaure or the Friends of Khufu, which doesn't exactly scream forced labor. Number 9. They had a thing for board games. After a long day of building pyramids, what did an ancient Egyptian do to unwind? They played board games. The most popular was a game called Senet, which was played for over 2,000 years. It was so important that it was often included in tombs, as Egyptians believed the game's journey-based layout mirrored the passage into the afterlife. Think of it as a much more spiritually significant version of Monopoly. Number 8. They had remarkable rights. While not a completely egalitarian society, ancient Egyptian women enjoyed a status that was unheard of in most of the ancient world. They could own and inherit property, run businesses, enter into legal contracts, and even initiate divorce. Unlike in ancient Greece, where women were essentially the property of their husbands, Egyptian women were legally independent, and if they worked the same jobs as men, they were entitled to equal pay. There were even female pharaohs who ruled in their own right. Number 7. Cleopatra wasn't Egyptian. She is perhaps the most famous queen of Egypt, but Cleopatra VII was not ethnically Egyptian. She was actually Greek Macedonian, a descendant of Ptolemy I, one of Alexander the Great's generals, who took control of Egypt after Alexander's death. The Ptolemaic dynasty ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years, and for most of that time, they maintained their Greek language and culture. In fact, Cleopatra was one of the very first members of her dynasty to actually bother learning the Egyptian language. Number 6. Their medical practices were a wild mix. Ancient Egyptians had some surprisingly advanced medical knowledge. They performed complex surgeries, set broken bones, and had a deep understanding of anatomy thanks to mummification. They even had dentists who created rudimentary fillings and bridges. However, their remedies could get strange. They used honey for its antibacterial properties, which is smart, but other prescriptions included things like crocodile dung and mouse paste. It was a real hit-or-miss situation. Number 5. Pharaohs were often overweight. The iconic image of a pharaoh is a trim, godlike figure, but reality tells a different story. Mummies of royals revealed that many of them were actually overweight and unhealthy. Their diet, especially for the elite, was heavy in beer, wine, bread, and honey, leading to obesity, diabetes, and clogged arteries. So the art was more of a stylized ideal than a realistic portrait. Number 4. Makeup was for everyone and for a reason. Both men and women in ancient Egypt wore dramatic eye makeup, typically black coal and green eyeshadow made from ground minerals. This wasn't just for vanity. They believed the makeup had magical healing properties and offered protection from the gods Horus and Ra. They also believed it deflected the harsh sun's glare and could ward off infections. And modern science has shown that the lead-based makeup they used did in fact have antibacterial properties. Number 3. They kept a staggering variety of pets. Egyptians loved animals and were one of the first civilizations to keep household pets. Cats were especially revered and associated with the goddess Bastet. Harming a cat,
even accidentally, could result in a death sentence. But it wasn't just cats. They also kept dogs, monkeys, falcons, and even crocodiles as pets. These beloved animals were often mummified and buried with their owners to join them in the afterlife. Number 2, the world's first labor strike happened here. Think worker protests are a modern invention? Think again. The very first recorded labor strike in history occurred in the 12th century BC during the reign of Ramses III. Workers building the royal necropolis at Deir el-Medina hadn't been paid their rations of grain, so they organized and walked off the job, staging a sit-in at a nearby temple until their demands were met. It just goes to show that complaining about your boss is a timeless tradition. Number 1, they weren't obsessed with death. This might be the most profound misconception. With all the mummies, tombs, and funerary texts, it's easy to think the Egyptians were fixated on death. But the opposite is true. All those elaborate preparations were because they were obsessed with life. They believed the afterlife was a continuation of their earthly existence, and they wanted to make sure they had everything they needed to enjoy it forever. The tombs weren't gloomy places of death, but eternal homes for the living spirit, fully furnished for a fantastic eternity. So there you have it. From unionized pyramid builders to makeup-wearing men and board game fanatics, the real Egypt is a place far more dynamic and surprising than the dusty stereotypes suggest.